we are carrying a whole lot of debt, whether it's the debt of legacy technology or culture or the decision debt itself. And as a result of that, someone else pays for it.
Where are we heading as an organization? And why are we just investing in technology when we're not actually looking at what outcomes we want from that? You make a decision, make it. Don't re-ask, don't say, give me more data, because this is going to become paralysis, right? I've heard organizations continuously say these words. We've always done it this way. And that, I think, is the bit which kills experimentation. It doesn't provide people with the habit or the viewpoint of let's try and innovate. Let's try and look at this from a different perspective. Every year, the biggest challenges are always culture and change.
Considering the world that we are in today, there's a lot changing, and there's pretty much all organizations are going through transformation. And I found that almost 80% of transformations fail. Um, and they fail
Mm-hmm.
because we've talked about this. And I thought we'll go deeper into that because if I'm an employee in an
Sure.
organization, we are carrying a whole lot of debt, whether it's the debt of legacy technology or culture or the decision debt itself. And as a result of that, someone
Mm-hmm.
else pays for it. Um, as an individual working in an organization, how can I recognize these invisible debts? And how do I maneuver through them? And how do I really create
Mm.
impact for myself and the organization? If there's a playbook of sorts we can give our audience, who's primarily the age group of 25 to 45, um,
Okay.
they might be playing various roles, right from engineering and development and innovation to QA to quality, data analyst to, sales, marketing. And we might also have a whole bunch of CIOs, CDOs making these decisions as well. So I felt like there are two audience pools we are really touching on. And I felt
Mm-hmm.
you would be just apt in this conversation because both from your own personal journey and then the journey you're on now in driving transformation, there's a lot of insight we can bring together over here. Cool with that?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. All good.
All
Yeah.
right. So Samir, welcome to the Attitude Makeover podcast. Honor and delight to
Thank
have
you.
you here. Uh, I wanted to start off with before we really get into the topic of invisible debt and how to maneuver through it, a brief introduction about you. Who's Samir?
Sure.
What's been your
Yeah.
journey?
Sure, absolutely. Well, look, so Jania, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really, really looking forward to our conversation, and it's been, it's been a long time coming, I think, because we tried to do this before. But I'm so pleased to be here. So, it, back to my introduction, a quick one. So, look, again, thanks for having me. I'm Samir Sharma. My journey started in the days of the big enterprise transformation. Things like ERP, CRM, re-engineering business processes, and I think that early work really shaped how I think about organizations and the role they play in driving change. And in about 2002, I fell into data, and that really then gave me a very much wider perspective on how data plays into how organizations transform. And fast forward sort of for the last, I've been in the data industry now, and transformation for the last 25 years. But the last couple of decades, I've spent leading transformation programs and advising executives on data and AI strategy. And eventually, I founded Datazoom to bring all of my experiences together, helping businesses build those foundations, whether those are data, transformational change, understanding operating models, and the capabilities that organizations need to actually use data and now AI to run, grow, and transform their organizations. And just a little bit on the human side, I'm Indian. I was born in Africa, in Kenya, to Indian parents. Moved to London when I was very young. I been brought up in London, as you can tell from my accent. And yeah, I run a podcast that you've been on as well, called the Data Strategy Show, and I've just finished my first book, and that's all about my data and AI strategy canvas.
Oh,
So that's a
lovely.
little bit about me.
Lovely. I think what really caught my attention, and I was doing my groundwork before we connected with you, were three pieces. One is an astute understanding of psychology, especially behavioral psychology. And
Right.
I feel
Yeah.
when one was leading transformation, if you don't understand the psychology of change, um, it's a little more difficult and challenging. And for me, that
Mm,
caught my
mm,
attention first. The second
mm,
is your, your emphasis on system thinking. I think we'll go more
mm.
in depth today on that particular area because, again, when you do a small app upgrade and to when you understand the system and then consciously lead a transformation, the impact is very different. And I felt like you would
Absolutely.
be great to really talk about it. And then of course your experience in government programs as well as in
Hmm.
organizations, and also through your podcast, going into the depths of understanding transformation and the new age of transformation around AI and analytics and data. Um, there's a good side and there's a bad side. So it felt like, you would be just apt to come and talk about this topic of invisible debt and, how can one really
Hmm.
understand it.
Hmm.
So, first of all, thank you so much. So
No, my pleasure.
I want to start with first a textbook definition and then a Samir definition of what is invisible debt. How do you
Mm,
define it?
yeah, yeah. It's an interesting one because I don't think organizations really talk that much about invisible debt, and I think these are the accumulated. If I think about it, over the years, it's the accumulated compromises that organizations make, consciously or unconsciously, around that eventually come back and bite them, in some manner, shape, or form. And as you in your opening quite rightly said, it's not tech debt per se. That's one component of it. It could be cultural debt. It could be the decision debt. It could, and the human debt. In terms of the impact it has on us as people and working in these organizations. I think they're all interconnected, and therefore I think it really is that mass of things that happened over X amount of years that no one's really wanted to tackle. And everybody goes in the same direction, thinking that, oh, things will change. We'll get new technology or we'll get new systems in, and that will make people change. And that will make people do things faster, more optimized, and so on. I don't think that that's always necessarily true. And I think it's become a very large challenge, as you said in the opening, that 80% of transformation programs fail. That's, the biggest challenge. And I would say the people quadrant is probably one of the biggest areas in that, that whole culture debt is a massive impact. I think the technology is becoming easier, even though we still have a lot of tech debt. I also talk, I also think that there's a lot of data, and now there'll be a lot of AI debt as well, because people are rapidly always trying to create something, and they're building models. And where do those models go? Where do they live? Who updates them? If they're not being used, why are they still there in some in some system? And so I think there's a lot of things that people just take for granted because we've got the tech and we can do it. So I'll stop there, and maybe that will give you that's my view on the sort of that invisible debt that
No,
I've
I
seen.
like it. And I like the fact that you've kept it current as well, because in tech, you're actually going further to, as exposed to the legacy debt as a seller, because oftentimes you
Mm,
carry legacy systems. And you need to keep that in mind when
Yes.
you're designing something. But now with data, garbage in, garbage out, and what kind of data really is making sense and how do you pull it together. I'm glad you added that as well. Um, I want to ask a follow through here. In your experience
Mm.
driving or enabling transformation, can I call you a transformation catalyst of sorts in the role that you play?
Well,
Is
you can.
So I would take that you are more exposed to, like, when you meet somebody, uh, I'll give you an example, and I'm very infamous for detouring, so keep me grounded here. Um, I'm normally the kind who, when I meet someone in the first 5 minutes, I sort of have an idea of, okay, where's this headed? Is this person a
Mm,
good candidate for the company or not, etc. And I would think these are more sales traits that you sort of practice and build over decades. In your case, as you go into this transformative role and meet a whole bunch of
mm,
CEOs and C-suites who are trying to
mm.
transform an organization, what are some patterns of these debts that you've seen? Like, these are very glaringly out there. Hey, easy to catch them.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think there's so let me just talk about the conversation that I might have with a CEO or a CIO or a CFO, and I think that's an easier way for me to sort of describe it. When I walk into that room, I'm seen as the data strategy, the data and AI strategy guy. I'm seen as that guy who comes, oh, this is the data guy. He's going to help us do the data stuff. And the first thing I actually talk about to them is I say, well, tell me what is this the culture of your organization? How have you come about? And they sort of look at me and say, why are you asking me those types of questions? And I said, well, I want to understand how the fabric of your organization works. Because if you're really serious about transformation, then I need to understand that fabric, the decision making, the way that power is embedded into the different types of the organization, the rights and rituals in the organization, who does what, who says what, how is it built, what's the narrative. And I think those are kinds of questions that will suddenly sort of close people up and say, wow, I didn't think we were going to be speaking about this, because I thought we were going to go straight into data and how that can help my company drive revenue and cost savings and so on. And I say, yeah, we'll get to that, but let's talk about this stuff first, because it's also an identification for myself to understand whether change can happen at a rapid, accelerated viewpoint, or whether it's going to take a long time for this change to get done. And I have to bake that into every single conversation I have, because otherwise that failure rate that you talk about will be right up there. I will never be able to impact the organization as much as I want to, nor will the technology, nor will any kind of processes be impacted. So it's having that conversation first, which is often the really difficult, uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous conversation, because they could look at me and say, "You're the wrong guy. Get out of the office. I don't need this kind of person. I need a person who's just going to say, yes, we'll stand up this system, we'll deliver it, and it will look like this." But actually, what I'm worried about is, sure, we can do all of that, but what's the pattern that I've seen? You can deliver a system, but how is that going to affect the person working on that system? How are they going to onboard it? How are they going to work with it in their day to day? How is it going to impact the dynamic between colleagues or between suppliers or external people who might be interfacing with you? All of those things in the ecosystem, I generally tend to find that people have a playbook, which is change management comes at the end
Mm.
of the cycle. We will train somebody, and that's that.
Yeah.
And we'll give them a training manual.
Yeah.
But actually, it's about the cultural mindset. It's about the behavior pattern change. It's about the way that we work as individuals as opposed to groupthink. So there's lots of different anomalies that can occur when you're actually embedding transformation into an organization. And if you're not ready for the impact or understanding of that culture, and look, we talked about culture for 5 minutes right now. People will be expecting me to talk about data strategy and how that will, be embedded. But that's the most crucial factor. If I don't know those elements or I don't understand the fabric of that culture, then I can never embed transformation into it properly. And where I can push and pull and the levers are for change. That's the bit. And only the C-suite can tell me. Then I can go down into the organization and I can understand the real emphasis or the real blockers or the real understanding of where that culture transpires, where it ends up, how it's actually being used or modified, or in the everyday practice. But if I can't hear it from the top, then it's very difficult to actually embed. Sorry,
No,
I'll
that's
hand it over to you.
this. I think the initial part, it's very important to start clarifying some of these foundational pieces. The power.
Yeah,
I've had this. I think it was in most of our sales playbook. It was the first slide. Culture eats strategy for breakfast,
yeah.
uh, and I think it was Peter Drucker. If I can,
Drucker, that's right.
right? It's
Yeah,
one
yeah,
of their
Peter Drucker.
quotes.
Yeah.
And I never understood this till I got into sales. Um, because in sales, it's hard, but then it's easier to sell technology, but it's a lot more
Mm,
difficult to enable adoption across an organization.
sure.
And it comes down
Yeah,
to this part. This is where the rubber hits the road. And this is where
of
we
course.
sort of fall through the crux of it. Before we get
Mm.
into more clarifying questions around this, can you help one understand what's a system?
Well, if we go back to the traditional view of a system has an input, it has something that goes into it, whether that's it, and it's an external thing, and then it processes something. It transforms that, whether that's through a series of uh, process changes, updates, and so on. And then there's an output. And with that output, we are getting, the transformation of that input. And then there's a feedback loop, which basically goes back to that input to say, did we do something right or did we do it wrong? So in essence, a system should generally be viewed as that sort of cycle. Now, I think if you look at culture and if you look at the way that impacts a system, I think one needs to sort of understand that now we are probably dealing with largely open systems, which are more dynamic in nature, more human resistant, because now we are moving towards the algorithmic world. And by the human resistant, I say we don't necessarily always need a human in that loop, dependent on what we're trying to do. So I think that definition of system is still clear, but I think the references and the points of contention are probably with how we behave with it, how a human behaves with it now. Because you can look at the whole AI world, and AI has been around for 50, 60 years. This has been around since the 50s, right? 1950s. I think the term was coined in 1956. And those are the machine learning algorithms that we've been using for many, many decades have slowly moved from statistical viewpoints to accelerated views around neural nets and so on. But sometimes we might call them a black box. And that black box is where that sort of closed system is, because we don't know what's happening inside it. We don't understand the output. We don't understand the transformation. So this whole idea of it now needs to be a lot more open as a system is something that I think we need to understand how we interact with that, how decisions are made from it, and how it's going to impact us, and what we need to do and take that sort of output and use those feedback loops to continually keep refining and reiterating, and iterating, and making sure that we are not losing sight of the actual purpose of that system. So I think for me that definition of system is still there, but I think we're moving towards more of those open type of systems where many interaction points and many variables are going to come out of it, which we can't handle. And naturally, a system, a system that crunches data at milliseconds, sub milliseconds, whatever, is the only way that we can do that now to understand that. But that explainability is crucial for us to understand, and that's more of that sort of open system thinking.
So, for someone who is in a organization that is going through or is contemplating going through change, a massive
Mm,
transformation, um,
mm,
how do I understand where all we carry the debt? Here's why I'm asking you this. As someone who's led various roles, right, from a developer to a program manager to a product manager, and eventually sales. Um, it's broken in multiple siloed spaces. And when you
mm,
think of
mm.
transformation, you're bringing all these siloed bodies together to function as a seamless end to end system. Um, and so it's very important to step back and sort of see, can I recognize what is my system and what are these various debts? How do I see them? Could
Yes,
you give an
yeah.
explanation, an example, or an anecdote of sorts that you've seen, or probably
Mm.
a theoretical explanation as well?
Sure. So let's go back to your initial question about that invisible debt. So we talked about three types of debt, which the first one is the one that everybody probably knows, the technical debt that we've accumulated over years of, as you talked about, legacy systems being implemented to now more of the new type of systems on, from legacy to cloud and so on. So I think we have to, legacy systems were there because they did a decent job. Some of them still do decent jobs. If you look at the banking industry, a
Yeah.
lot of the old AS400 systems where I started my programming on, they're still used. They're still there. COBOL programming is still needed. It's a necessity. But I think they're sort of held together by goodwill and duct tape right now. And that's one thing that we need to recognize. I think the other things are, the endless workarounds that we continuously have to do in organizations, and no one wants to touch that particular workaround, because if we do, it's going to break. And oh my God, suddenly it's been there for 20 years, and then panic will set in, and there will be mayhem. And I think it's this backlog mentality we've had. We'll fix it later, kind of, sort of viewpoint of I think that just sort of slows things down, or makes things more expensive. So most organizations that I've worked with live with that technical debt, and it's a feature, of how they operate. Um, and I think that is always going to be there. It's always going to be a liability for organizations. It's about managing that. It's about pinpointing those areas which need to be updated, need to have a fresh new lick of paint applied to them, because that tech debt will eventually slow people down. And I think you'll see that, in those legacy industries who are finding it very difficult. I had a conversation last week with a client in the insurance industry, and they are finding it very difficult to move away from their legacy on-premise world. And they're saying, well, if we move to cloud, what is that going to be like? Are there security implications? Now, they're having that conversation now, but yet they're living with this technical legacy debt, which is slowing their business down. And I think it slows the business down, and it sort of, it counters the ambition of where people want to get to. So I think that is something that we have to think about. The second bit, which we talked about, was the whole culture debt, and I think this is the silent killer for many organizations. I put it that way. It's quite hard because I've heard organizations continuously say these words: "We've always done it this way," and that, I think, is the bit which kills experimentation. It it doesn't provide people with the habit or the viewpoint of let's try and innovate. Let's try and look at this from a different perspective. And I also think that this idea that some people say that lots of organizations have become flatter, but I think there's still an obsession with hierarchy in particular cultures and organizations, more so than outcomes. And that creates, for me, that creates an environment where people stop trying to improve things. Now we're in a really, really accelerated pace of technological development, and people who are not going to embrace this development are simply going to be left behind. So there are those organizations that have accelerated, who have experimented, who have gone against the grain of their own cultural habits and tendencies and formations, to actually say, how can we look at this thing as a way to change the dynamics of our business? But yet there are other people, for example, the client that I was sitting down with last week, who are still hesitant about it and saying, oh, what will we do? How will it work? Oh, we don't know how to make the decision about it. Oh, our IT people are saying that we shouldn't go cloud, blah, blah, blah. This is a really scary moment for some people to be thinking in that way. So I think, we've got to stop protecting the status quo. And I think people in organizations need to speak up a little bit more, because the cost of staying quiet is incredibly insane, and that's going to kill those organizations. So that culture that I think, and as you talked about it, culture eats strategy for breakfast, people say for lunch and dinner as well. But that culture debt as well sits in, I think, I've seen it many times. It sits in many PowerPoints in organizations, big, great presentations, but very little progress in terms of what that looking at that debt and really countering that debt and trying to understand. So, and the third thing, which we talked about earlier, was the whole decision debt. And I think this is another bit, which is, again, if I take the comparison, if I take my client, their inability to decide of where they're going is having an accumulative effect on their competitive nature in the market. Delayed poor decisions that compound over time will dent their business, and it will create a bunch of people inside the business who will be saying, we want to move forward, but we can't because we're constrained by these decisions that these leaders or these people have made. So I think that's one thing that I see around that accumulation of decision debt. And you'll see it in, you probably saw it in sales, marketing, across every single function. And I think it paralyzes the organization, that whole, the second conversation I have with CEOs, apart from the change conversation, and this is actually about, how do you make decisions? How do you make decisions internally? Is it gut? Is it using data? Is there some playbook that you've got that you can look at that and say, how do we do it? And actually, it's mapping those decisions, which will help them see, which I don't think many organizations do very well. If you map decisions from what you've done and then understand how that impact has sort of followed through and where it's impacted your organization, again, whether that's a risk view or managing risk, or whether that's a revenue view, or whether that's managing cost efficiencies and so on. I think that people don't map those decisions as they should and see where the decision falls down, where we get that debt, where people are not following through, and therefore that particular strategy that was agreed upon is not being followed through because of that decision cycle. So I think it's a bit of paralysis, and I also think decision debt is I can't stand the whole thing about endless committees meeting and trying to make a decision. That annoys the crap out of me, because so many organizations have that mentality. Oh, let's spin up another council or a subcommittee, or you can't keep doing that, because that's just going to kick the decision down the road, and actually people will lose sight of what that's going to be. So I think, it's, if you've got this decision debt, um, it paralyzes the organization. It slows the execution of what you're trying to do. It definitely increases costs, that's for sure, but people don't understand what those costs are. And I think it creates that fog where nobody really knows what good looks like anymore. But worse than that, it sort of then signals out to the rest of the organization that decisions in our organization aren't really decisions. They're sort of just temporary opinions, that we're going to revisit over and over and over again. So I think, those are the three types of debt that I see. Um, and and I think the tech debt creates that sort of friction, because people lose the trust. They start creating those workarounds. They struggle to see what the actual end goal is. Um, then, the workarounds from that become that cultural way of working. Again, back to, this is how we do things here. And then the whole decision cycle, it's, the culture, drives slow, unclear decision making. So it just reinforces that decision debt, and it's like a vicious circle that we keep going through in organizations. So hopefully that kind of gives you a view of,
Well, it
how I
does.
see it.
It really does. Because I think it's important to, so as someone who's maneuvered through various roles, I felt I gradually understood this because I was in roles which were driving change eventually. But as an
Mm,
individual
mm,
contributor, I don't think I ever thought of this as a connected set, right? It's quite
yes.
easy to sort of miss it completely in the process. And this is where I was specifically asked about if I'm an individual in an organization, how do I identify them? Um, in this process, when you were talking about it, you talked about culture and also decision debt. Um, a
Mm,
big part of it is how susceptible or your organization is designed to have these kind of conversations. You talk a lot about the tech trap uh, in
yes.
your
Yes.
conversations,
Yes.
optics of the being ugly versus the beautiful, and what's your
Mm,
minimum viable. So, with the context of what you just explained, if I am an individual who's now been able to look at in my role, here are things, this is how the system looks like. These are my inputs, these are my processes, these are my outputs, this is the feedback. These are the kind of debts I see. From
mm-hmm.
there, how do I go about first? So, my immediate one would be understanding the tech trap. And from there, how do I go about having these kind of conversations?
Mm, mm,
It's very easy for me to sit here and say, hey, Samir, you should have just talked about it in the meeting. But if my culture
yeah.
is such that, anyone who speaks is like, especially is not speaking the same language as the rest, is like, hey, you
Yes.
stay aside,
Yes.
big ones are doing the work. How do I go about first understanding this for myself and then
Mm,
being able
mm,
to own that seat on the table and creating that
yeah.
kind of an impact as well?
Yeah. I think that triangle of invisible debt. Um, it's a good question, and I think where it's probably easier for, or not easier, it's never easy for an individual to sort of start owning that. But I think one has to first acknowledge that we've got the debt, give it the language. You know, you can't fix something that doesn't actually have a name. So you've got to identify what those parameters are, what those systemic, you know, challenges are. And I think that's got to be articulated in a way, because if it's invisible, then no one's going to speak about it. Yeah. So you've got to articulate that. You've got to give it a language. You've got to bring it into the conversation, because just talking about technical debt is everybody talks about it, and they just sweep it under the carpet, or decision or culture, right? The second thing I think, which a lot of people, and it goes back to the tech trap that you mentioned, most people will go straight into the whole technology piece. What they're not doing is they're not focusing on the outcomes that you actually want to achieve. So focus on those outcomes that you want to achieve, not the systems that you have, because I think that really helps people to focus on where are we heading as as an organization. And why are we just investing in technology when we're not actually looking at what outcomes we want from that? So I think that becomes easier to have a conversation about the sort of debt, because it becomes easier to talk about the language and prioritize things. The other thing that I think people don't necessarily do, and I talk about this a lot in my in my work, and I'm an operating model specialist, and a specialist, or I don't know. Yeah, I've just been doing operating models for years, and I think that brings together some things that I see organizations that don't do. They don't really look at their internal operating model. How are they designed to deliver stuff? How are they designed to collaborate across functions? How are they designed to make decisions up and down the organization that need very quick, timely decisions, that needs to get something out of the door because it's a new go-to-market strategy or it's a product, etc. And I think that is something that's quite flawed in organizations. And that, again, comes back to the cultural piece, which is that culture that plays into it, because the operating model is not redesigned. It's not redesigned every time we get a new shake-up of technology, every time we get a new shake-up of leadership, every time we get a new shake-up of external regulatory parameters that are coming into organizations. So I think that operating model design is something that's really key and missed very often. And I think that also comes with governance. Now, by governance, I don't mean the whole bureaucratic, as I said before, let's build let's put together a set of committees because we like to meet and have committees. It doesn't need to be bureaucratic. I think it lends to the whole decision debt. And if you can go back to what I mentioned around mapping decisions and being able to understand and isolate which decisions we need to make fast and accurately and with competencies that we've got, then we should be able to do that. We should also be mapping the decisions that don't do so well, in the organizations. And that will play into how we actually govern ourselves. So the operating model and the governance come sort of hand in hand. And again, they don't have to be bureaucratic, because right now we need to be quite dynamic in the way that we work. And then I think one of the ways that so the big bang, right? We used to do big bangs all the time in transformation. They do these big bang implementations, expecting everybody to onboard everything in 1 second, and the organization forges on, and we're going forward to do what we're supposed to be doing. It never worked, right? So now I think we have to create these, because of the technology, because of the debt that was created. I think people are becoming so skeptical that we now need to create these small wins that will restore that confidence. And I reckon that sometimes, if, I still see the conversation, should we roll it out to everybody? Should we, I was working with an organization in the States where they said, well, we're going to do it. We're going to do a rollout of the system, and we're going to do it in a sort of big bang. We're going to roll out to everybody at the same time. I said, well, hang on. How do you know that all of the organizations that you're going to roll out to have the same competencies in the systems? They've got they can onboard stuff very quickly. They can absorb what you're doing, that they haven't got to change their processes. So all of those conversations, those questions made them think, oh, so we haven't really gone and spoken to those people and understood how they will onboard this, how will it affect their culture, because these are smaller organizations as part of a bigger whole, but there are independent organizations. Some of them are mum and pop shops, some are huge big organizations, but they all have various different capabilities, the way that the change is impacted and culture is onboarded. So I think that small wins to restore that confidence, I think, is the antidote probably to a lot of the cultural and decision debts that we've got now. And then I think, here's something that I've seen recently, and something that I've been thinking about over the years, because organizations live and breathe and die because of people, not because of not because of the technology. It's because of the systems that we've created, right? And those systems include that human input. And I've seen studies um, and I've done live studies when I was doing organizational psychology. We brought people into a conference, and we then decided, interesting enough, and this is quite let's build an organic organization. And it was a weekend offsite with an organization and a whole bunch of different people, and we said, okay, let's build a new organization. How is that organization going to form itself? How are we going to forming, norming, and building the usual hierarchies? Interestingly enough, there were lots of people in that room who were saying, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to be dynamic, we need to be progressive, we've got to take on new processes, etc. And then as they started forming roles, as they started forming functions, as they started forming the narrative and the strategy, they went back to how an old organization would operate. So I think we have to make everyday decisions, and we have to think about the technology that's definitely going to help us. And we have to think, and I think that what we're missing in organizations, and that many people think that, not just me, that data and AI, in the way that we call it now, I think we should be embedded as the catalyst for behavioral change, not just technology uplift. And that's one thing that many people are missing. And that's where new business models will form. That's where new operating models will form. That's where new go-to-market strategies will form. And I think those are the two areas that are often overlooked because, it's just data and AI. It's not, and in fact, people used to say it's just data, it's just bits and bytes. But now I think people need to rethink the way that their organizations are forming in that way. So I'll stop there because I think that's talked about quite a lot of stuff.
I think one thing that really caught my attention is the role of data and how that is changing today. Uh, I can totally relate with that, specifically around, um, human behavior, I guess. I've noticed this when you take data and have data led conversations. It's a double edged sword. It depends on the quality of data. But if you got some really
And the
good,
context.
if you got the right data, then there is a much more, um, remove the emotions and the riffraff, and you're able to focus on the problem, and therein then
Correct.
bring a solution together, which otherwise, considering a lot of our debt is invisible and names are not,
Mm.
you know, given to each one of these, it can just be like, you could just hover through it and, oh, this is how it is all the time, and we move on from there. We just, you know,
Yeah.
rid off the
Well,
problem itself.
you're so right, because we were working earlier this year. We worked with an organization in Mexico, and we were doing their data strategy for them. It was really interesting because as we were doing that, I put my transformation sort of lens on, and I looked enterprise wide, and I realized that there's many things that were not working in their organization outside of the whole data piece. Now, the one thing that triggered the curiosity was the fact that their net promoter score and their customer satisfaction score was coming down rapidly. And it was almost like, well, why is that happening? What's the root cause for that? And therefore, it just showed, as we started having the conversations a bit wider, because I said to the CEO, I'm seeing very different things here that are impacting the way that you will behave as an organization. And I'm also seeing the evidence through the data, but I'm also seeing the fact that you're disjointed in some way, and you need to rethink your business model and your operating model. So just seeing that from data made us realize that there's another factor here, or a set of factors, that they need to rethink the way that they operate in a way. And actually, that conversation was really interesting, really insightful for the CEO. But it's only because we could see those data points as they were emerging and as we were talking to people. So, take the emotion out, talk about it, and actually think about how it's affecting the organization, because you've got the root cause. You understand, you've got some metrics there. You can measure things, and you can see how it's affecting the people internally. People were not working well together. They were blaming each other for things. Systems were not getting finished or completed because there was a backlog of sorts, and there was a lot of infighting. So tons of issues and challenges came up from that. And just presenting that and naming it, and letting the CEO absorb that and say, I think we have got a problem. You're right. And I think this is the area that we need to move forward in. And, it's you've identified that. So just bringing the outside perspective as well, not just focusing on data all the time, because that's one thing that I've seen a lot of data practitioners do. They will just focus on that data bit, or and then not see the impact in the outside world. And I think that's where having that transformation lens for the last 25 years, and then being able to orchestrate or understand how systems work and how organizations work, is really important. And it's key, and I do see that's the bit that I'm really good at. And so seeing that is really important. And being able to step back and say, where are the problems? Because it's not always going to be, the problems where you think they are. So I think that's something that really needs to be better in organizations. And I for over the years, myself and others have advocated for things like a chief transformation officer, which will actually be able to look at that holistically, look at those improvements that need to be made. But they will tie those decisions and the cultures and the data and the AI and things together in a way that will help people articulate it better, but will see the whole, but will understand how it's all going to work together. And I think that's one thing that's not articulated well across many organizations. That's why you still get projects being worked on over here, projects being worked on over there, programs, delivering. No one really understands what the other's doing. And I still see it today. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that because it just reminded me of that early work we did earlier this year.
I want to, in your journey, does an experience stand out in this to see this one particular one really brought out these various debts, or probably one debt which is so big that
I'm smiling there.
because see the stats say
I,
80% sales, so I'm
yeah,
thinking you must have seen ample number of examples of this falling
oh my
through the
goodness.
cracks.
Yeah. I can point to one this year actually, which, and that's the reason I'm smiling. And it's not smiling because I want to, it was heartbreaking actually when you're going into an organization and seeing exactly what's going wrong, and that you can see it, and and I'm not going to name the client because I can't do that. But essentially, we were asked again to come in and do a data strategy. And an enterprise-wide data strategy for them, very, very greenfield organization. They'd never done anything of that sort. And when we started off doing the whole vision piece with the executives, so it was a couple of days. We had sessions on the one day to understand the challenges and so on, but really trying to articulate, where's the organization going? What's the corporate strategy? How are we going to actually move towards that? And then looking at the sort of push and pull levers of how data can play into that, because we always start with that corporate strategy, that business strategy. We've got to understand that, because you can't really do anything without understanding where is the organization heading. But as we started to then have the conversations, the execs, put them into different various smaller groups. They started to have different conversations. They started to furiously draw up on boards, and and as I was walking around and going around to the various groups, I started to see a pattern emerge, which was a lot of people are talking about the fact that they've invested huge amounts into a specific CRM system, but they're not getting stuff out, and they're not getting quality back, and they're not getting insights, and it's not driving the way that they thought the business was where it was heading. And then I started to hear conversations around toxic cultures with subcultures in the organizations, which was really interesting as well. People going out and making their own decisions about what tech to buy in. And, so again, this sort of shadow IT, shadow data teams that are doing stuff. And that really scared me because I'm there to be doing something that's bringing people together, but actually we're seeing now this whole identification of a ton of different challenges, and really quite impactful for them, but not really tying it together again. You see, so just going around and looking at all of those things, I said on at the end of day one, I said I think we've got a real problem here. And as a consultant, right, as somebody who's been brought in from the outside, I think I can say those kind of things. I can say in a comfortable space, and look, we've seen things that I think need to be tackled. Otherwise, I think your organization is not going to head in the right direction. And therefore, you probably need to look at these three things in your organization. But what transpired is a recognition, and it was great because I actually named those things in that session. And it was a bit stark for the executives. They were a bit panicky when they heard me say that, and they weren't necessarily happy. But if I hadn't brought that out, I think we would have just gone through the motions, you know, of doing this stuff. But as a consultant, I believe it's my responsibility to say, hey, you need to sort these things out before you do this stuff, and to the detriment of maybe of the strategy that I was doing. And in that moment, it's they said, oh, okay, so can you help us kind of work this stuff out? And I said, sure, because come from that transformation background, come from CRM and so on. So yeah, we can do that for you. But until I identified it, until we spoke about it, until it was named, and so many people came up to me afterwards and said, we have been talking about this for a long time. No one has actually believed that there is an issue. But until somebody came in from an external perspective and was able to put the dots together and highlight this stuff, but actually what happened is because of the process that we went through, a lot of the executives were presenting back, talking about these issues, and therefore it was quite visceral for some people. So they could see that these challenges were there, and that made them really uncomfortable. And some people got emotional as well. So that needs to be brought out in those conversations. You can't just be an organization that works on logic all the time. You need emotion, because this is the people side of it. You need that visceral feeling that something is going wrong. If we just say, oh, we're going to buy in technology because for technology's sake, then that's not really looking at the whole of the organizational transformation. So just to come back to your question, yes, that was a really, really interesting use case for us, because it made us realize that this was a massive organization, had a lot of impact to a number of other organizations around the States. And if they didn't get their house in order, that organization was not going to exist in the next 6 to 12 months. And that's how it transpired. So really powerful stuff. But actually going back to what I said earlier, if you don't name it, if you don't bring it out, if you don't, tackle it head on, and you don't have the brevity to do that, then I think you're just going through the motions. So that really was a transformative change, and just being able to then say we can help you, and bring an independent view into that, and we did it in a really, really quick. I think it was about 11 days that we looked right across all of their systems, their integration points, their data, their processes, their culture, their change, and really did a comprehensive view of it, giving them back a report outlining where they were heading, where they were going to go wrong, and if they didn't tackle these things, then they were going to be spending way more amount of money than they would have expected. So I think those kinds of things that are really, really, for me was a massive making a difference in an organization, which, and again, being an external, I am happy to take on that role of, I'm going to challenge you because that's my role. I'm not here to pander to, yes, sure, we'll do it that way because that's the way it's always been done. But yeah.
I sort of noted down three things over here. I really like the first one, which is you need to be able to name it to be able to
Yeah.
solve it. I recently was in this completely different space, but we were talking about Eve teasing and teasing. And the general thing is,
Sorry,
oh, it's
I
just
missed.
Eve teasing. Where in India, when you're walking by, there's someone whistling or someone just
Oh, I
they
see.
call it
Yeah.
eavesdropping, right? So eventually they called it teasing. And the instructor came and she said, "Hey, wait, hold on a second. It's very important to use the right word to describe the
Hmm.
problem. It's not teasing,
Yes.
it's sexual
Yeah.
harassment." Uh,
Correct. There you
right? And
go.
when you
Yeah. Yeah.
look at the
Yeah.
problem with the proper definition and a word given to it,
Yes.
everything else starts falling in place. And I
Hmm.
think that's what
Hmm.
I mean, those are extremes. But here also, it's very
Yes.
important to be able to name it, and
Correct.
everybody
Yeah.
can sort of put some effort into that. The second thing that you talked about, and I won't go into more detail over there, is I want to bring your knowledge on behavioral economics and the psychology of change over here. Um, there's this railway station very close to my house. Um, it's like this old colonial railway station about 5 years back. And suddenly,
Hmm.
the many trains coming to this particular station going to Kerala from Karnataka. These are two states in South India.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
suddenly, the number of people who come to this station has, gone tenfold, has increased
Right.
tenfold. And so the
Yeah.
government decided, I'm going to upgrade the railway station. And they brought in, more stands with shade and,
Hmm.
steps and everything else. And I recently went to the station. It looks really nice. And there are more trains coming in, more passengers. But there's no an escalator or a lift. So someone who's
Yeah.
designed the station or the work there has assumed that the population that comes there is not going to be above 45 or 50 years old. No disabled people are going to be commuting and traveling. And this is where my question comes. As an
Mm.
individual, we've now talked about being aware of the debt systems and how to recognize them. And I want to put on the behavioral psychology hat and
Mm.
ask you,
Mm.
as an individual, I might be contributing unaware or aware to the problem
Mm.
itself, like the
Mm.
steps in the staircase versus the escalator. I've completely missed a data set itself, and as a
Yeah.
result, my
Yeah.
design is flawed. And the debt of this is very expensive for me to solve much later. How do
Hmm.
I sort of understand the behavioral psychology and where are my biases? And, you know, how am I contributing to this?
Yeah, and I think that that's something that is an early indicator of and coming back to your example, it is an early indicator of design thinking because in that example, no one understood the flows, no one understood the impact, no one understood mean to have 10x more people walking through the station, and just not making sure that there's no bottlenecks anywhere, or so it's a design thinking view of putting the customer first and actually understanding what would they want to, empathizing with them. And I think that sort of it, that that way of managing or designing systems is the right way that we should be thinking about, because we're not doing that.
Yeah.
The sort of the behavior always is, let's buy a system because that's the system that we want, because it's got a label on it called CRM or ERP or finance or whatever the system might be. But it's not empathizing with the people who are going to, it's not really going customer first, right? It's not looking at who those people are that are going to be using it. So that psychology of understanding the consumer, understanding how you will design a space, how you will design the flow, how you will design how somebody decides whether they will take the stairs or whether they will take an escalator based on the certain factors, whatever that might be. Um, and I think that the behavior of people is difficult to always predict when we're understanding systems and understanding the flows and processes. But so that's why we have to sort of do that. It's always, and I think that's where that expression comes from, putting yourself in somebody
Another
else's
piece.
shoes. walk the shoes that person walk the in their shoes and understand their what they do. And I don't think we do that enough. And therefore, that's why the whole psychological barrier to adopting systems is in place, because people don't build knowingly from the perspective of the individual and interaction. Now, I'm not saying you're going to be, taking every single individual, but you have demographics, you have the nature of behavior, you have you can observe, you can see what people do, and observation is a very powerful act when you're understanding the dynamics of systems. You can, if you're implementing a system, or if you're, designing a railway station or a building, you're going to look and see how people interact. How do they walk? What are the things that they're looking at? How do they, interact with the buildings surrounding it? Or if you're building a system, what are the first things that they're doing when they go in? How do they actually utilize, what's important for them? And therefore, is that important for the people around them? And therefore, in that function, and but we don't do that. We just literally will go in and say, here's the system, use it.
Mm.
Companies will say that they don't do that, but I reckon that's why, going back to the failure rate of 80%, and now in the whole data and AI space, people are talking about an 85 to 90% failure rate. So I don't think people are designing, and design thinking is talked about a lot, but I don't think people invest that time up front to understand the psychology and the behaviors and the outcomes people are looking for. All they're worried about is quickly getting a system in so that they can show they did a bit, in budget or under budget, and they delivered it on time. And that's no longer a kind of metric that, okay, it's a metric there, then we need to make sure that we're not spiraling and going too far over the cost. But it really is, think about the designability, think about the way that people are going to interact. I remember doing human computer interaction and in university. And that's when we work, we would work through how do you interact and how do humans interact with computers and systems and so on. And then you think, well, hang on, shouldn't we be doing that now as well?
Yeah.
And it's not.
Yeah.
Because the accelerated development of stuff is going so quickly that, new systems come out all the time, and, oh, we've got a new system now, we're going to do this. But, I often ask myself the question, do we need all these systems? Will we need these systems as we move forward? Because the system is going to break down with how we're going to maybe be embedding, AI in the future. And will we need an ERP? Will we need a CRM? Will we need all those things? And I think these are the psychological factors, again, that we need to ask ourselves, how we design our organizations and how we design our business models. So, yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question entirely, but I think, that there are the parameters that we need to think about, again, around safety, around ethics, but designing for humans rather than designing for technology. And I think we've got to switch it, because if we think about what everybody's talking about around AI and quantum comes in, and no doubt other new technologies that haven't emerged yet, they're all saying the same thing. The nature of work will change, human expressive, the nature of how we work will change. We will lose jobs. We will, and the cycle continues just like it does in every industrial revolution. But I think that's where we need to design for ourselves, not for the AI. And that's what we're doing wrong. I think we're designing for the AI right now. We're not designing for ourselves.
Yeah.
So, yeah, hopefully I've meandered probably,
No, you did. You did. I have a follow up over here. I have found in the past, and I continue since I am in the space of change. Um, I've always been wondering, why is change so hard? Change is so inevitably, it's a constant. We've been taught that change is a constant. Everybody talks about it. And we know, we
yeah,
see it everywhere around us. Things are changing. Everything is changing. Like, um, my early
yeah,
years to today, to I can tell you the next 5 years are not going to be the same as the last 5 years. So things are are
mm,
changing at an accelerating pace at this point. And yet, there is a human reluctance, uh, almost a defiance to change. Like, this is working right now. Why do you want to change? So, change is so
yes,
hard. in spite of knowing
Yeah.
that change is inevitable. What have you seen as, reasons or pushbacks one gets within an organization context for why does change become hard in an organization?
I so if I look back at my career, and if I look back at the work that I've done in the last sort of 14 years at Datazoom, and the organizations I've worked with, I think the pace of change hasn't stopped for many organizations. So that's one thing, right? There's always going to be some transformation happening
Yeah.
on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis. It never stops. It just seems to me that it's just continuing. Now, I think that rate of change is something that has probably um, affected a lot of people in those organizations, because what happens is the skepticism is then built into the conversation, because they will say, oh, we're now going to do this new initiative. Well, didn't we do that 6 months ago?
Yeah.
And what happened to that? Well, then I'm going to be skeptical about this new thing that you're saying is not really new, but it's something that we've done already. Oh yeah, because that didn't work, so now we're going to bring in somebody else to do. And you see this whole narrative just continues. Organizations cannot stick to one type of consistent organizational change. And I think that's, again, back to this whole decision making criteria. I also think that that's down to what I call the operating model, and the operating behaviors. So again, people have had, and to go back to your point, humans change every day. We do, but we change in small ways, right?
Yeah.
That's it. I must change every day because my daughter comes back from school. She's 14 years old and she says something new to me. And I say, oh, I don't know what that means. I need to kind of understand it. I need to unpack it. I need to understand it from her perspective, not from my perspective, because I'm not a 14-year-old girl who goes to school. And, and the world when I was 14 now is very different, so I can't even compare the two. I can't say, well, when I was 14, it was like this. You should say, yeah, so what? Life has changed. So I think we do make small changes, and I think that's something that organizations need to understand. That while it's great, we do all these transformational efforts and so on, and most of them fail. It's the small wins. I think it's the small wins that stick. So I think the operating model, and I go back to the new ways of working now, are going to have to be realigned, readapted, reimagined, whatever word we want to talk about. And I think change is a constant, but in organizations, we need to have a cycle of, I'm going to develop, I'm going to develop, I'm going to deliver, and I'm going to, and in that, I'm going to understand, the way that we're going to onboard this thing from the beginning. So I think that needs to change because, as I said earlier, everything about change comes at the end. So no wonder people really feel that they're just having this stuff thrown at them rather than being consulted or asked about what's going to happen. I also think that a lot of organizations build for one-offs still. They build for reusability. And this is a factor in change as well. So as I talk about, data and AI to organizations, and it goes back to what I talked about earlier, data debt and tech debt, data debt and AI debt, is that if we're going to build systems, if we're going to build dashboards, if we're going to build data sets, if we're going to build algorithms, let's think about reusability. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to keep rebuilding this. For example, you've got 3 use cases. Number 1 use case uses five data sets, right? So you build that using those data sets. Use case 2 uses 2 of those data sets. So there's no point in going out and reapplying those new data sets. Cannibalize, use them again, reuse that into that use case, and so on and so forth. So you're building that incremental change into the way that you operate, into the way that you will affect that change. And I think that that's one thing that many people don't do, that reusability factor, because I think that economy of scale will help when you actually think it that way. I think the other thing is I think we've got a whole knowledge problem because many organizations have lived with this whole idea that knowledge, that they've never really managed it properly, right? It sits in people's heads as opposed to it sits in systems. So this whole knowledge management idea hasn't really surfaced well. But we need to do that, right? Because we need to understand these new systems cannot be the single point of failure. So if that person who knows everything and is that if they walk out of the building tomorrow and get run over by a bus, then that's done, right? So documenting that knowledge, building that in, we've got that knowledge somewhere. I walk into many organizations and I'll say, right, have you documented your processes that you're currently doing? And they don't tend to do that because it's sitting in somebody's head, right? So that whole idea of documenting, and nowadays with AI, it should be easier. We should be able to do it much quicker. We should be able to, put it into an AI and it be able to understand what you're doing and be able to redesign things and spit something out that is more cohesive than what we've got now. I think just those are small things that we should be having. Every single organization I go into never has processes, never has process maps, never, and I talked earlier about mapping decisions. They don't have those things. And then I think coming back to your other point about the transparency, using data as a mechanism for transparency is not what organizations want to do, because that actually creates a lot of friction. And I think that's one thing that needs to change, because we don't want to have black boxes telling us what to do. We don't want to have people building these mysterious and magic spreadsheets that nobody understands how to use. So we've got to become more transparent, because that's how we're going to go into the operating model of the future. That's how we're going to be better humans. That's how we're going to be better colleagues and collaborators and so on with each other. So I think that's something that we don't do. And the final thing I think, which I should have probably put at the beginning actually, is that we don't reward for outcomes. We don't do that. And that incentive-based view is not really baked in. We try, people talk about it, but they don't. And I think it comes back, to the previous point around data transparency. So, let's reward impact and not activity. That, all we're looking at is the cycle of measuring people and what they're doing, but actually not the impact they're making. So let's reward based on that rather than, as I said, just the tasks that they're doing. And, oh, yes, I've done it. And, so that is a big thing that I don't think organizations have dealt with. So
This
yeah,
is very
five things.
helpful actually, because you talked about how to navigate through this debt, right? If I was in a system of this kind, how do I maneuver through it? How do I navigate through it as well? If I could sort of bring it together, you're basically reiterating that you need to stay curious, incorporate some of the principles of design thinking to
Yeah.
really understand what are you trying to build. The second part that you talked about knowledge, is a big one, and I feel it's a very important one that's not understood. In the past, knowing it all, being the go-to person was a big deal. But I feel
Yeah.
in today's world, as a individual working in an organization, knowledge is so easily accessible, if not within your system, from outside. And
Hmm.
I think the goal then should become how quickly can I become dispensable, isn't it? Instead of being
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
indispensable. Huh?
Yes. Correct. Yeah. 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 Which is a great way to look at it. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
And
if
and, and I
I,
think that's I guess the psychological safety that people need,
yeah, mm,
to feel like that. And I don't think they do,
right,
because that's not the way that organizations are built, right?
yeah,
They're built to be these hierarchical organizations, and
yeah,
and that people don't feel safe in
yeah.
that sense around being able to push that, that dynamic. So
Mm.
yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also liked your last part, which is on the incentives or the reward structure.
Mm,
Again, it comes down to um, the impact I created. And this is a big
mm,
learning for me. I think as a developer, as a product manager, program manager, is to insist that we have an incentive structure where it's not based on lines of code you write, but
yeah.
the and I
Yeah, the
think it
impact, the outcomes.
right.
Yeah.
It's very important. I don't care if you're putting 4 hours, 5 hours, 12 hours. That's accountability, responsibility from an individual's perspective. But what's the impact you're creating? How much rework have you put back into the system? Basically, what is the debt you put back into the system?
Yeah.
If I'm
Correct.
measured on those and my reward system is built on that, it's a very powerful structure
Mm,
to make a
mm,
system work as well.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I want to ask
Absolutely.
one more question here before
Mm,
we move to the last part. So, we talked about navigating through this system as an individual. Is there a playbook I can give to someone who's walked into an organization new? Hey, to say, hey, this is day one, this is 30, 60, 90. Somebody walks into
yeah.
a organization. How do I sort of put a playbook that
Mm,
allows me to understand the invisible debt and then to be able
yeah.
to first put a picture for myself? Because a big part of this, what you're asking is, Samir, build a narrative that you can go speak. And you might have a very unfriendly culture. You might have a
Mm,
very,
mm,
closed
yeah.
system over there. And yet we're sort of nudging one to, push the envelope over there. So is there a
Mhm.
playbook or sorts that we can give someone who's lasted this long with us?
It's probably going to reference some of the things that I talked about earlier. So the first thing I would always do is, you know, is diagnose what these debts are, right? Um, and have a really brutal conversation about it. An honest, you know, um, understanding of what those run a diagnostic, whatever it might be. I mean, that's what I would typically do. Understand the signals for the tech debt. What are those signals? Um, is there a high reliance on spreadsheets? Is there a lot of workflows are held together by kind of tribal knowledge? Um, is there no real understanding of architecture across the organization? Are data quality issues always surfacing daily? Um, is there a quick fixes mentality that always that we'll just keep doing quick fixes, and that becomes the permanent sort of narrative across the organization. I think those are the kinds of things that I would be looking for
Mm,
if I'm diagnosis on the sort of tech side. um, I'm just going to try and give you examples on the culture side. What would I be looking for? um, oh yeah, comes back to what I said earlier. We've always done it this way. And then what I often look for: how collaborative are we across the organization? Is there sort of low cross-functional collaboration? And then is there a culture of experimentation, or is there an avoidance of it in the organization? Um, and to come back to that whole dependence on one person, um, is there always the reliance on the hero rather than the systems? And I think again, that probably that sort of transparency and accountability piece, because I've seen organisations that I worked with this year that have very large management structures. No one's accountable, and that's strange for me. Very strange, and therefore decisions don't get done. So, decisions don't get made, and then where and I think the other thing is around what we talked about is where data is not trusted, and they will default to the person who's got the highest opinion in the room.
yeah.
What I talk about is the hippo, the highest and most important paid person in the room. So I think those are the sort of signals from a culture perspective, and I think when we're talking about decision debt, I mean that's things like long decision cycles. How many times do you repeatedly revisit the decision that you've made? I find it quite funny is when people keep asking for endless data, because that also means that they can't make a decision, right?
Yeah.
They can't focus. You make a decision, make it.
Yes.
Don't re-ask. Don't say, "Give me more data, give me more data," because it's going to become paralysis, right? And I think also, what I've seen, clear ownership of decisions as well. And again, going back to what I talked about earlier about that whole bureaucratic piece is, decisions made by committee, to avoid risk, and I think that's one thing, which is huge. So that's the first thing I would probably. The second thing is I would try and prioritize the sort of debt that I've categorized earlier. Where you would, what's the impact to our organization? What's the impact on execution of it? The usual people will have, different 2x2 models that they'll have, high impact, low sort of, cost versus value. And then, one could typically ask, what's the cost of fixing stuff now? Looking at how do we actually prioritize and fund stuff? How do we delegate, versus automate? How do we stop stuff? So just thinking about that sort of prioritization view, and I'm probably not articulating the quadrant well, because but it's really, thinking about that impact on execution and versus the cost of fixing it, and what actions you need to apply based off that. And then the third thing I think it's really about the plan of how you're going to reduce that debt, because then you're taking the you've named it, you've articulated it, you've prioritized it, and now you're thinking, well, how do we actually systematically tackle that invisible debt? So, I think, again, coming back to it, is simplifying that sort of problem landscape, identifying that problem, putting a problem statement down, saying what it is, building that in that decision making capability, that sort of governance view that accelerates those decisions, not slows it down. So, again, that's going to provide clarity, accountability, and not more documents and not more committees. The other, so problem, decision. I think the third part of that is, and it's probably thinking about how we rewire the behaviors in the organization, and rewiring that through particular use cases, because it rewiring culture is very difficult. Rewiring behaviors is very difficult. And I again come back to this thing that I see with change and culture, is that it's not a training exercise. So I often look at it this way, you can only shift the culture through actually doing something, right? You can't shift it through training. People will just be aware of it, but by actually doing it, you're affecting that change, that impact that you're going to have. And I think that's the thing that we need to look at. So I think that's the sort of thinking about that debt plan, or reducing that debt. And then the next thing is, hey, what I always say is that new way of working, that operating model. How do you embed all of those changes into it? How do you change workflows? How do you make decisions quick? How do you do that whole idea of reusable assets, and removing those single point of failures, and rewarding those outcomes, but changing the dynamics of the ways of working, having different having engagement frameworks that are far more dynamic and quick, and decision making authority, and then I think that's kind of but actually thinking about, or one other thing is, again, you got to have some values in the organization. You got to have some principles in the organization, which will allow you to come back to, because you could very quickly derail the conversation as well if you or not derail it, but stick to it if you don't have some principles. So I think it's really having the sort of key principles. What are red flags? What are the red flags that we should be thinking about if a decision is revisited over and over again? That's a kind of red flag for me, right? Um, if nobody owns processes, how will we understand whether there's degradation in that when it needs to be renewed? So, I think that's something that's often missed as well. Processes in many organizations, um, and there was something that I said earlier about workarounds. If we continue around the system, it's actually the system is the problem.
Yeah.
So, being able to have that principle and saying, no, we don't do that. If the system is a problem, we look at it, get rid of it, or redo it, or whatever it might be. So I think rewarding, rewarding people as well, in a way through that whole accountability and transparency, um, and being and just making sure that innovation doesn't die in the organization as well. Yes, we've got to do the day to day, but we've got to think a little bit forward. So you've got to have some principles around that. I would have to really think about those principles in a little bit more detail. But yeah, I would say that's that's kind of a playbook that I would use, and it's just off the top of my head. But hopefully that would help expose the debt. It will make sure that culture doesn't hold us back, and we should start making transparent, quick decisions through that. That's the sort of the way that I would
This
see
is
it and where we want.
this is pretty comprehensive because we sort of, in a way, you sort of brought the whole conversation together,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Because
Because
yeah.
right in each stage, one thing that really I found very was my litmus test. In addition to a lot of these that you've talked about, I could exactly go back to my career journey and see, oh, this was so
Oh,
easy. These are red flags, and
yeah,
this is the kind of thing, right?
yes,
Because I feel
yeah,
when you're stuck in a system which is inefficient as this, um, and you're carrying the debt of someone else who's put the debt into the system, you're not experiencing burnout or any of those. You're experiencing a sense of value or the lack of it. And,
yeah,
the
yeah.
inability to change, like, it's just like a despair state of this is how it's going to be. This is how it is kind of thing,
And
right?
that's what, yeah, and that's what most people live through,
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, in organizations. And I think there's going to be huge ramifications as we go into the next 3 to 5 years on what's going to happen with AI. And, I think we're not ready,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
We are.
A lot, I mean, I don't think many organizations are ready. And I think that
True.
whole readiness factor is something that's
So true.
huge. Yeah.
I also found here, Sonia, two additional things. One is you touched
Mm,
on it, which is the reward system. One of the things for me to gauge the culture of an organization is who gets called out, who gets rewarded, and for
right.
what behavior. Oftentimes, it's the hero curve that normally gets called out, but not the ones who've really gone through every aspect of the system to make it foolproof. Um,
Hmm.
who is the savior for the immediate, short term, gets the big share of the pie. And I think that's a big way of looking at the system to understand
Yeah.
where's the debt going. The second one I really
Hmm.
found useful, and this came up much later in my career, was how much cross collaboration happens within teams. Um,
Mm,
we're so siloed, like, I think I know it all from my team, but I found the most innovative set of people have a lot of people they've networked with, not for the sake of networking, but for
Yeah,
leading with curiosity and then trying to see, hey, can we just do a quick prototype? Can we do this? Can we run this? And sometimes it goes beyond the organization. Sometimes it's within the organization. Sometimes it's within a
yeah,
platform.
absolutely. And I think that space needs to be made, for people to do that. And because we aren't just sitting in our silos, and we are creatures of curiosity, and we need to extend that visibility across other parts of the organization. And I think again, it's how do we affecting change is not just about me, it's about how do I touch other people across the organization and have those conversations which are going to be more which are going to be different about that new way of working, or whatever it might be. So I think there's that as well, which we really need to consider more of.
So, in your perspective, what's the most
Hmm.
dangerous debt that we carry in an organization? Which one is the most dangerous?
I still think it's culture debt.
Yeah, I think so too. I think so
I
too.
still think it is, because
Yeah,
it sort of masters all the others,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
I mean, I think this is where many organizations would say we've got our culture, we've got our, we know exactly what we're doing. We've got a vision statement, we've got a mission statement, we've got a set of values, and everybody lives and dies by them. But
yeah,
I sometimes don't see that when I go into organizations.
yeah,
I I think that there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. We're human beings. We have a role to play in society. We have a role to play in our homes. We have a role to play in our organizations. We have a lot of hats to wear. And where if we're not happy in a place, we simply won't operate at our highest levels.
yeah,
And that's true of every single hat that we wear.
yeah,
So allowing some behaviors to emerge is not such a bad thing
yeah,
in some ways. Obviously, you don't want them to be bad behaviors, but creating the place for that sort of thinking and I think some of the larger organizations, the tech companies do that. I think they give a certain percentage of time to their employees to do their own thinking or do their own little side projects or whatever it might be. Um, so I think culture is always. If you look at all of the reports, in the data industry, every single report there's a report that's done every year by Randy Bean and Tom Davenport, which talks about the biggest challenges. It's a data and AI executive survey, and every year the biggest challenges are always culture and change. And why does that happen? Because no one really looks at it, because they're too worried about the tech, or they're too worried about something else, and they keep missing it.
yeah, yeah. It holds good for homes. It holds good for nation states. It holds good for organizations, schools,
Yeah,
everywhere.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and we need to keep reevaluating those
yeah,
things, don't we? Because even in the home,
yeah,
decisions that I make, or my wife makes, or my daughter makes every day are going to impact the way that we operate.
yeah,
I mean, we are a system,
yeah,
aren't we?
yeah.
That's what we. Um, so yeah, I think culture will always trump everything else for me.
Well, thank you so much. One last one. What does attitude makeover mean to you?
Oh, what does attitude makeover mean to me? Oh, that's a question I didn't think was going to be asked. Um, well, I think it's about having the positive traits of what you want to do moving forward for your life, and for how you exist as an individual, um, and what you want to achieve. And it's really creating the space for you to think and be that person you want to be, and help those people around you be those people who they want to be as well. So it's just not a singular facet. I think it's more of a much wider perspective of me, because it's about the ego, it's about the id, it's about everything else that we talk about. And I think attitude makeover, and I come back to a few of the Hindu sort of, philosophical things around, being selfless and thinking of other people. And I think that sort of plays into it as well. So, yeah, that's what attitude makeover means to me. Didn't think I was going
Fantastic.
to be asked that
Thank you
question.
so much. Thank you. I think if I could summarize today, a lovely conversation, first of all, and very rightful person to be sitting across with, because we started off first understanding invisible debt. I don't think these kind of conversations happen from an individual and an organization's point of view. It normally happens from a transformation or an odd transformation point of view. And I feel
Mm,
it's very
mm,
important. As much as there are stakeholders outside for the business side, every employee is also a stakeholder in an organization. And
yeah.
so this is an important conversation. So we covered everything from what is an invisible debt, recognizing it,
Hmm.
then becoming aware of, how to identify them. Then we
Hmm.
went into how to navigate them. We talked about even a playbook that helps one to look at the flags, red flags, and also to sort
Yeah.
of hold a mirror for yourself to see how are you contributing to the whole problem statement itself.
Yeah.
So, Samir, thank you so much. Long conversation, but a very important
Yes.
one. Thank you so
my
much.
my pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show. I've really had a fantastic time, and really tough questions for me to think about. But thank you so much for that, Sajanya. Really enjoyed it. Thank
Thank
you.
you.